There is a completely new meta right now in Clash Royale, and with the upcoming global tournament starting really soon, well, it's about time to go over the top 5 decks for April of 2022. Let's get right into it. Number 1. 3 Musketeer Spam. That's right, 3 Musketeers is officially back in the meta. With the buff of the Elixir Collector, well, no deck goes better with the Elixir Collector than 3 Musketeers. Especially due to the fact that Elixir Collector is a negative Elixir trade when you spell it. Well, this just makes 3 Musketeers even more effective. Starting off the match, I'm generally going to be pretty passive. The main goal in single Elixir time is to get as many Elixir Collectors down on the field as possible. Aside from that, however, you do have some quick pressure that you can cycle either at the bridge or in the back, say a Barbarian Barrel, a Royal Ghost, or a Golden Knight. That being said, this deck also has a heavy bridge spam element as well, so if your opponent spends a lot of Elixir in the back, well, feel free to apply a ton of pressure and just spam your units in the opposite lane. The great thing about this deck is it actually has the mirror, and especially with the +2 level buff, the mirror is so effective because let's say you spam your elite barbarians at the bridge in one lane, well then you still have another set that you can play on defense as well. Here's another trick with the mirror actually. Let's say I have my mirror in hand and then I play my elite barbarians and then I play a Golden Knight. Well, because you can't mirror a hero, you can actually mirror the elite barbarians a second time even though you just played the Golden Knight. That's a little bit confusing to explain, but trust me, it just makes the mirror even more deadly. In double and triple Elixir time is really where you'll start using your 3 Musketeers, splitting them in the back, using them to defend first, and then turning them into an offensive push. You almost always want to go double lane with this deck, because of course you're splitting your Musketeers in the back, so you should be splitting your push at the bridge as well. On defense, this deck is super solid and can cover pretty much any type of ground push, but the only weakness is against air decks. So keep in mind that if you simply do not have any way to defend an air push, well then just pressure the opposite lane. Number 2. Royal Giant, Giant Skeleton. That's right, this deck is officially back in the meta. Royal Giant, Giant Skeleton is a very interesting variation, and it's much more of a heavier variation. Therefore, you're going to still be playing it sort of like a control deck, but there's definitely a bit more of a beatdown aspect as well. Starting out the match, I'm always going to play pretty passively. Maybe I'll cycle my Zappies or an Electro Spirit in the back, but in general, I'm just going to be waiting for my opponent's plays. So on the defensive end, you have a ton of options. Of course, you have the Fisherman Hunter combination to pull units in and then deal high amounts of damage with the Hunter. You also have the Zappies, which will buy your other defensive units a ton of time, and the Giant Skeleton, which just serves as the universal lane clogger unit. Moving on to the offensive end of this deck, well, as with most Royal Giant decks, there are 2 main ways that you can play this Royal Giant. The first is at the bridge off of a surviving counter push. Oftentimes, you will have units that survive a defense, namely the Giant Skeleton and the Hunter, and if you have the Elixir, well then just go ahead and play a Royal Giant alongside those units and try to get that Royal Giant to the tower as quickly as possible. The second option is to build up more of a beatdown type of push with the Royal Giant in the back and then just supporting your Royal Giant like you would any other tank. Again, it's important to keep in mind what counters your opponents have. If they have a single target heavy hitting unit, well then make sure you Fisherman that troop out of the way, or alternatively, if they have more swarms, well then you might want to get your Hunter or your Log in as your first support cards. Last but not least, the Earthquake is an insanely clutch way to get past buildings as well as get a ton of tower damage, and in double and triple Elixir time, you can honestly shift to just simply spell cycling your opponent's towers. Number 3. Skeleton King Bait Spam. That's right, with the mirror being so good in this current meta, it is even better with bait. I mean, in a deck where you're trying to bait out the opponent's small and medium spells, the mirror is just a perfect fit. Starting off, this deck is a bit more of an aggressive deck, so at the beginning of the match, I'm generally going to be starting off cycling something cheap, either at the bridge or in the back. Again, you generally want to be in the driver's seat of this match, and you pretty much always want to keep your opponent on their back feet, always always trying to defend your pushes. So of course, in terms of main offense, you have the Goblin Barrel as well as the Skeleton Barrel. You can send these one at a time or both together in combination. Just make sure that you time your pushes properly so that the opponent cannot get too much value with, say, a single log. Secondly, you also have the Skeleton King, which just synergizes with this deck even more. With the amount of spam that this deck has, every single time a unit dies, you're feeding a soul to the Skeleton King, and so his ability just fills up so quickly with this deck. Moving on to the defense of this deck, I do want to note that the first line of defense will always be a good offense. If the opponent plays something expensive in the back, then of course pressure the opposite lane with some of your spam units. But aside from that, you can also use the bait element of this deck on defense. The Rascals, the Skeleton Army, and the Dark Goblin are all insanely effective on defense. Make sure that you're spacing these units far apart so that the opponent cannot get as much spell value. Again, on defense, the Mirror can be insanely effective. Mirroring your Dark Goblin, mirroring the Fireball, and mirroring the Rascals can come in insanely clutch in certain situations. And all in all, just a very fast-paced and fun deck to play. Number 4, Golem Beatdown. Golem Beatdown is still insanely good in this meta, especially due to the fact that buildings just aren't too popular. If the opponent isn't prepared, it is very easy for you to just push a golem through your opponent's defenses. Starting off in single elixir time, this is a pretty expensive deck, so I'm going to be really passive and really reactive to my opponent's pushes. Of course, if they spend a relatively expensive unit in the back, well then you might consider going in with a golem immediately in the same lane, but in general, I much more prefer laying low and playing a bit more defense until I reach double elixir time. So on the defensive end, you have so many options. First off, the Tombstone is insanely effective at stalling the opponent's pushes and buying your towers and troops more time. Secondly, that also synergizes with the Skeleton King, which can harvest the souls from the Tombstone and then spawn even more skeletons himself. Finally, you have the Night Witch for damage and the Baby Dragon for splash, which altogether makes up an extremely well-rounded defensive arsenal. Once you reach double elixir time or feel like you have a big enough elixir advantage, well then it's time to go in with your golem. 99% of the time with Golem, I'm always going to be going with the Golem behind the King Tower. And then what I'll generally do is initially support the Golem with just 1 or 2 support units at most. This is to avoid giving your opponents too much spell value because that can be the one issue when you are playing a Golem deck. Once you do bait out your opponent's spells though, it is very okay to just go all in and unload all of your units at the bridge. Last but not least, it is very important to also use your spells on both offense and defense. On offense, the Tornado synergizes super well with both the Baby Dragon as well as the Golem, pulling units in so that the splash damage can take them off the arena. Lightning is also there to take care of any heavier units such as buildings or the Archer Queen, because again, the whole goal of a beatdown deck is to get a massive push to the opponent's tower. All in all, a very easy deck to pick up and play, so definitely one of my top choices for this month. Number 5, Skeleton King Graveyard. Now, of the 5 decks I'm sharing today, this is probably one of the decks that was also extremely popular in the previous meta. This Skeleton King Graveyard deck is all about control and counter pushing. So starting off the match, I'm again going to be very passive in reacting to my opponent's plays. To be honest, I'll usually just cycle a Tombstone in the middle, and that generally does the trick. So starting off on the defensive end, well, of course, for splash, you have the Skeleton King as well as the Valkyrie. The Skeleton King still synergizes very well with the Tombstone, which provide him souls in order to feed his ability. Then you have the Zappies, which also synergizes with the Tombstone and can slow down the opponent's pushes, and you also have the Inferno Dragon to take care of any sort of tanks. One thing to note on defense though is to make sure that you don't give your opponents too much spell value. The Zappies and the Tombstone are honestly not that tanky, so it's important that your opponents cannot hit both of those units with a single spell. Moving on to the offense of this deck, most of the time you're going to be going on offense after a successful counter push. Maybe you have a surviving Skeleton King or Valkyrie or Inferno Dragon, and then you can just go in with a graveyard on the opponent's tower in addition to that. An important note when actually going in with your graveyard pushes, make sure you use your spells effectively. And if the opponent has swarms or any sort of medium unit, a set of arrows or fireball can be extremely effective effective at taking out any of your opponent's counters, so just make sure that you don't go all in all of the time and save some elixir to use your spells on offense. Finally, it's important to note that the Skeleton King is another important offensive tool, especially with his ability charged up. One of my favorite plays is to sort of do a 2-wave graveyard push, where I first go in with a graveyard on the opponent's tower, and then once the graveyard stops, I go in with my Skeleton King ability to spawn a second wave of skeletons. All in all, an extremely solid and fun deck to play.